This crash course breaks down 5 core system design pillars for DevOps and cloud architectures: scalability, reliability, security, performance, and observability. Welcome to my part 1 of our 4-part series, where we will be building a production-grade e-commerce microservices application in AWS EKS with CI/CD, GitOps automation, and an AI ops layer. So from part 1 itself, this is just not theory. Every concept that you will see will be connected to something directly that you'll be running in the project. So if you're someone preparing for a DevOps role, brushing up your system design concepts, or just trying to understand how real production systems are built, this video will give you the complete mental model. In real-world interviews, nobody really asks you to define Kubernetes or list a bunch of cloud services. So what you are really tested on is, do you understand how systems scale? How can you make it reliable under failure? And is it operable in production systems? Even for entry-level engineers, you need to understand why a certain tool is picked, what is the trade-off, and why a certain system design decision was made. So we are going to follow a structure throughout this project. Under each pillar, we'll cover the key concepts, mechanisms, and how seamlessly it fits into the project. Let's get into it. Number 1. Distributed systems. This comes under the pillar of scalability and fault tolerance. Let's start with a very simple question. If one server can run your application, why do companies need hundreds of servers? For instance, small applications runs like this. A user makes a request. It hits a Nginx proxy server that basically does the routing part. The request that goes into the application backend, and then the application makes a connection to the database. Everything on one machine. Simple, fast to build, easy to reason about. But as traffic grows, one machine hits its limits. CPU maxes out, memory fills up, a single hardware failure takes everything down. So the idea of distributed system is to split that one machine into multiple machines that communicates over a network. What is the benefit here? You can scale horizontally by adding more machines rather than constantly upgrading the single one. And you get fault tolerance because no single machine is critical. If one goes down, the other comes up. So there's no single source of failure here. Now you need to understand the trade-off. Since it's distributed system, you have network latency, partial failures, and consistency challenges. A request might reach machine A, but a response never comes back. Did it succeed? Did it fail? This is the core challenge of distributed system. So designing for failure is by default and not an exception. How it connects to a project? The entire application is a distributed system. There's a front end, 6 backend services, database, Prometheus, Grafana, all running as separate containers across multiple nodes. Each service is independently deployed and communicates over the common network. Now moving into our second system design concept, monolith versus microservices. So the concept here is microservices, but it always gets paired up with monolithic applications. Reason being, you need to understand how monolithic applications run and then what problems does microservices solve. This comes under our system design pillar, scalability, modularity, and independent deployability. Imagine building your first application. You have one code base, one deployment, and one database, login service, product service, user service, all embedded in one application. This is basically a monolithic architecture where everything runs under one system. When I say one system, it could be a single server, it could be a single pod within K8s cluster. But the idea here is every service is very closely tied to each other. Now coming back to application. This monolithic application works perfectly when you're starting. One code base to understand, one thing to deploy, and one database to query. But here's what breaks as you grow. When you add more services, for example, a notification service, which basically gives you an alert whenever an order is shipped. Now, what happens if this notification service starts consuming more memory and God forbid it takes the entire application down? Now, another scenario here is what happens if a product service needs to scale to handle 10x traffic during a sale? You just can't save that one single product service. You need to scale the whole application. And there could be multiple other situations, like what happens there's a bug in a payment module. You need to redeploy the entire application for it. This is why companies started decomposing monolithic application into microservices, where each business capability runs as an independent service with its own code base, its own deployment, and its own database. Now you can scale only the services that needs it. If product needs to scale, you don't need to scale the login service. A bug in one service doesn't kill the entire application. And even this becomes an interview question because here you explain how teams can work independently. Business team has separate set of services. Payment team handles different. And similarly, the design team has separate set of services. Now, the trade-off. In this architecture, you have network calls between different services instead of in-memory function calls. So there would be some latency. Also, you have distributed data, a lot of moving parts, which adds to operational complexity. In our project, we have 7 services: gateway, auth, product service, order service, user, frontend, and a few more. Each has its own Docker file, its own Kubernetes deployment, and its own PostgreSQL database. They all communicate through the gateway. A third system design concept is API communication. This comes under the pillar of loose coupling and interface design. Now, once you split your application into microservices, these services need to talk to each other. This communication happens through APIs. An API is basically a contract. One service says, send me this request in this format. The other says, here's what I'll return. Now, there are two primary communication patterns that you need to know. Number one is synchronous. Think of REST API or gRPC. By the way, these are both API types. And if you want to learn more, I've added it in one of our YouTube shorts below. Now, back to synchronous communication. One service calls another and waits for a response. Simple, predictable. Now, this method is used when you need an immediate answer. Now, in this communication pattern, REST is the standard, which uses HTTP and JSON format. Then there is gRPC, which is a little faster and uses binary encoding over HTTP2. gRPC is very fast and efficient for backend service-to-service communication. Now, our second communication mode is asynchronous. This is basically done through message queues. One service sends a message and it doesn't wait for an immediate answer. The other service processes it when it's ready. So this is used for tasks that don't need immediate response. Sending emails, processing systems, generating reports. Kafka and RabbitMQ are the most common implementations. It decouples service completely, which means if the consumer is down, messages queue up and gets processed when the server recovers. It's a very important topic and make sure you review this further. The way I like thinking of asynchronous communication is like think of it as you sending a message to your friend through WhatsApp. You may not get immediate response. They will write back whenever they see the message. Now, another API concept that we'll dive into is idempotency. Let's understand through this one scenario. The client sends a request to create an order. That request times out and the client retries again. If the API isn't designed carefully, there would be two orders that would be created. Now, how do idempotent APIs work here? No matter how many times you send the same request, it produces the same result. So the same example, if you send a request to create an order, and if there's a network failure, and you retry again, the result would be just one order. It's very critical for payment APIs so that you don't pay twice, order creation, and multiple other operations. And next concept is API versioning. With time, your application evolves. Your API evolves. And when I say API evolves, it's basically the services that you're running behind it evolves. So at times, you may change how an API responds from JSON to some other format, for instance. Now, if you upgrade the same API immediately, all clients that are using the same APIs will break. API versioning solves this. And the newer version could be /API/v2/orders. So the newer API can have a newer format. And all clients can keep working until they migrate. In our project, all services communicates synchronously through REST API, and the gateway basically routes to different APIs like /API/auth or /API/product. Now, our fourth system design pillar is service discovery. This comes under the pillar of loose coupling and dynamic routing. You have 20 microservices running in your application. Pod starts, pod stops, IP addresses change every time a pod restarts. And similarly, services scales up, scales down based on the request. How does one service connects to another service or basically talk to other service when the IP constantly changes? This is where service discovery comes in. There are two types here. Client-side discovery, where the calling service queries a registry and it gets a list of healthy instances from which it picks one. The client is responsible for load balancing here. Then there is server-side discovery. The calling service sends a request to a fixed endpoint. There comes a load balancer or a proxy that responds with a healthy instance list. Here, the client doesn't need to know anything about the underlying topology of healthy instances. The load balancer and proxy takes the call. Now, let's come to our favorite tool, Kubernetes. It uses server-side discovery. Every service gets a stable DNS name, and the platform automatically routes traffic to the correct pod. So instead of calling an IP address with a port, services just call a stable DNS name. So there is a component called CoDNS, which is a server running inside Kubernetes, which resolves the service and pod names into IP addresses. So in this case, you don't have to keep worrying around if a pod gets restarted 10 times. The inbuilt service discovery comes to rescue here. In our project also, there are no hard-coded IPs, and we use the stable DNS name and let the Kubernetes service discovery help with the service-to-service communications. Our next concept is load balancing. This comes under the system design pillar of scalability, high availability, and performance. Now, your traffic is growing. You have scaled to 5 instances. How does traffic gets distributed across all 5 of them? That's the job of a load balancer. But within load balancing also, there are multiple layers and multiple strategies. There's a layer 4 load balancer and then there's a layer 7 load balancer. Layer 4 is basically the transport layer. It operates on TCP UDP, it is pretty fast, low overhead, and route based on IP and port. This load balancer doesn't understand HTTP at all. So if you need raw throughput, which is basically the number of requests processed, you go with the L4 load balancer. Then we have the L7 load balancer, which is the application layer. This load balancer type understands HTTP, headers, URLs, cookies, can route based on the request, path, content type, or even host header. This load balancer type is used for intelligent routing. All the application load balancers across cloud providers as well as the Nginx load balancer operates at L7. Then the next thing you need to know about is load balancing algorithms. The most used one is round robin. Request goes to each server in turn. So request 1 goes to machine A, request 2 goes to machine B, request 3 goes to machine 3. It's simple and works well when all the servers have similar capacity and request takes almost the same time. Then the next algorithm is least connections. With this algorithm, the load balancer sends the request to a server which has the fewest active connections. It is better when requests have variable processing times. So the least active server can fulfill the newer request. Then there's IP hash. The client's IP determines which server will handle that request. The same client can always go to the same server. This is used when session stickiness matter. Then there's also weighted round robin. Some servers get more traffic than others because of the capacity. This is useful when servers aren't identical. One server could have like more CPU and memory versus the other one which is smaller in size. In Kubernetes specifically, there are different ways load balancing happens. Yes, if you know, the answer is through services. You have cluster IP, which is basically the internal load balancer. It's only reachable within the cluster and it's the default service type. It distributes traffic across pod using round robin via kubeproxy. Then there's node port service. It exposes a service on a port on every node. This one is used basically during development. Now the third type is load balancer. It provisions a cloud load balancer. Could be an application level or network level. Basically it can operate at L7 layer or L4. And the key part here is it exposes the services externally. Then we have Ingress. This is a more advanced version of load balancing within Kubernetes. It basically manages external HTTP or HTTPS requests and provide access to services using routing rules. So you have more options to customize it. Then comes Gateway. It's the more advanced, or I should say the expressive version of Ingress. It controls and manages the traffic into the cluster. Like I said, more expressive, so it comes with advanced routing, security, and control policies. In our project, Kubernetes cluster IP load balance the traffic between the pods. We also have a gateway service which is the centralized entry point. In production scenarios, you may use application load balancer or network load balancer, depending on the use case. Our next concept is high availability. This comes under the pillar of fault tolerance and redundancy. So let's get into the question directly. What happens when a server crashes? If you have one instance of your service, the whole application goes down. So that's called the single point of failure. High availability here means designing the system so that no single source of failure can cause downtime. And redundancy means running multiple instances of every service. If one crashes, the other one serves the traffic. Then there is multi-AZ deployment. AZ is availability zone. Think of it as different data centers in like different regions. If one data center in one city goes down, there's another data center in the same city that can handle the request. Then there are health checks. Load balancers continuously checks if the instances are healthy. Unhealthy instances gets removed from the rotation automatically. Another concept within high availability is stateless service, which basically means your service doesn't hold any state. Every request is a new request. It doesn't have any data in it. Now, how does this help? Here, any instance can handle any request. Scaling and replacing instances is not difficult. Otherwise, think of it like that. If an instance holds the state and it goes down, the data goes with it. This is also why we use JWT tokens. The tokens here carries the session state, not the server. Two metrics you need to know under high availability is RTO and RPO. It's very critical for interviews. RTO is recovery time objective. It basically means how long a system can stay down before it causes unacceptable business impact. So it's a metric. Then there's RPO, recovery point objective, which is basically how much data loss is acceptable. So if your database is backed up every hour, your RPO is 1 hour. In our project, we provision subnets across multiple AZs. And the Kubernetes node group spans across all the zones. So if one node in one AZ goes down, there are two other nodes active that can handle the request. And number 7 concept is auto-scaling. This comes under the pillar of scalability, elasticity, and cost efficiency. Another scenario, there's a sudden traffic spike. You need 20 pods at 6 p.m. and only 3 pods at 3 a.m. Now, paying for 20 pods all day is wasteful, and manual scaling is slow and error prone. You should not always depend on the DevOps on call to get up at 3 a.m. to scale down the pods. Auto scaling solves this. Now, auto scaling capabilities are available across all the cloud platforms. And in this section, we will be focusing more on the Kubernetes scaling part. Our number one mechanism is HPA, which is horizontal pod autoscaler. It watches CPU and memory usage across pods. When average CPU exceeds a certain threshold, it adds more pods. When traffic drops, it scales down. This is the most commonly used autoscaling mechanism. Then there's VPA. This is vertical pod autoscaler. Instead of adding more pods, it adjusts the CPU and memory request of existing pods. It's useful when you can't scale horizontally. For example, a single database pod. Now, there's a trade-off with VPA. You always need to restart the pod to apply the new resource limits, which can result into some downtime. Then there's cluster autoscaler. When HPA wants to add a new pod, but there's no node with more capacity. In this situation, the pod stays in pending state. Cluster autoscaler here detects this and provisions a new node. Same vice versa. When nodes are underutilized, it drains that node and removes it from the node group. It helps saves cost. Then there's KEDA, which is Kubernetes event-driven autoscaling. HPA scales based on CPU and memory. But what if you want to scale based on something else entirely? KEDA scales based on external events and metrics. For example, the number of pending requests in an HTTP queue, if there are more database queries, or even a custom Prometheus metric. This mechanism is significantly more intelligent than just CPU-based scaling. So whenever there are event-driven workloads, KEDA is implemented. In our current setup for the project, we are using fixed replica counts. KEDA would be a natural next step, but I would recommend you to go dive into it further. It's an important topic for AI workloads as well. Our next concept is reliability with Kubernetes. This comes under the pillar of resilience and self-healing. In traditional infrastructure, if something crashes, someone gets paged. They SSH in, restarts the service, and go back to sleep. Kubernetes introduces self-healing. The platform handles it automatically. There are few probes that you can set through Kubernetes. One is liveness probe. Kubernetes asks the container, are you still alive? If the container stops responding, Kubernetes kills it and starts a new one. It is used to detect deadlocks and unrecoverable states. Then there's readiness probes. Here, Kubernetes basically asks the container, are you ready to handle the traffic? Now, here you need to understand that a pod might be running, but it's not ready. Maybe it's still initializing in the backend. So this probe helps with it. Then you can set resource requests and limits. You can specify how much CPU and a memory a container needs, which is basically the request, and how much it can use, which is basically the limits. Also, remember with cluster autoscaling, we discussed this, that a pod can remain in pending state if it doesn't find the node where it can fit in. So here also the Kubernetes scheduler decides based on the request which node this pod should be placed in. Then there are other important topics like pod disruption budgets. It's basically you set a minimum limit, a set of pods that need to run in case of any disruption. This again prevents with accidental downtimes during maintenance. Then another object type is replica sets, where Kubernetes continuously watches the cluster. If a pod crashes, a node goes down, or a container is killed, Kubernetes replaces it to maintain a certain number of replicas active at all times. In our project also, every service deployment has a certain number of replicas. So we are using a lot of objects from here. Our next concept is security by design. Like the name suggests, it comes under the pillar of security, zero trust, and defense in depth. Now know this, security isn't a feature you add at the end. It's layered throughout the entire architecture. Now, few things you need to know under this concept. Authentication. Who are you? What's your identity? It's basically the username and password that you use. Then there's authorization. What your identity is allowed to do. It's basically done through roles, permissions, access policies. And next we have JWT. It's JSON Web Token. After you log in into an application, the server returns a token. It is a signed string that encodes your identity and permissions. And now, whenever you hit the application again, every request carries the same token. Otherwise, you might have to log in every page. Also, note that the server verifies the signature without querying the database. So, JWT tokens are stateless and the session information lives inside the token, not the database or the server. Another practice is using encryption techniques such as bcrypt. Passwords are never stored as plain text. Bcrypt hashes the password into another format. So even if the database credentials are compromised, the attacker gets the hashes, which is computationally infeasible to reverse. Or in simple language, they can't read it. Now, you might have heard a lot of people talking about zero trust. It's also a part of this concept. Now, what is zero trust? In traditional security, every request inside the network were trusted by default. Zero trust came in and it started implementing things quite the opposite way. Even within a network, you verify every request, regardless where it's coming from. So never trust, always verify. Within our application ecosystem, every service to service call needs to get authenticated, even internal traffic. Other key things you need to go through is Kubernetes secrets, configs like database password, API credentials. They all are stored as Kubernetes secrets. So you don't have to hard code anything in your environment variables. In IAM roles, you use the principle of least privilege. Even services need IAM roles. Your Kubernetes cluster cannot pull images from the container registry if it doesn't have permissions to do that. And those permissions are given through roles. Within Kubernetes security, there's another crucial component that is network policies. It configures which pod can talk to which other pods. By default, in a cluster, every pod can reach to another pod. But in a production system, you will restrict this. For example, the database service will only get requests from the application pods, not the gateway service. So you restrict the access here. In our project, we have used JWT authentication, bcrypt for password hashing, Kubernetes secrets for database credentials, and so we have followed all the security policies here. Our next concept is observability. It comes under the pillar of operational excellence. For example, if a user reports that the app is slow and then you have 20 services, how do you find the bottleneck? Without observability, you're basically guessing, oh, this service might have caused it, or that might be the issue with this pod. Now, within observability, there are three pillars. Logs. It's a timestamped record of all the events, every request that's sent, every error thrown, every database query. So the logs basically tell you what exactly happened. Then there are metrics. These are quantitative measurements over time. Request rate, error rate, CPU usage, response time. So the question that these metrics answer is the system actually working as it should? Now we'll be using Prometheus in our project that will scrape the metrics and we can visualize using Grafana. Another key pillar here is traces. It helps you trace every single request when it goes through multiple services within your application. When the user hits the checkout, it hits the gateway, then it goes to the order service, then it goes to the product service, and then it goes to XYZ service. Traces help you map this. Now for interviews, a standard way to think about metrics is using this format called RAID. R stands for rate, how many requests per second. E stands for error, what percentage of requests are actually failing. And D stands for duration, how long are requests taking. Now our next concept is deployment strategies. This comes under the pillar of continuous delivery and rollback safety. Now you have built a new feature, how do you make sure it goes into production without breaking anything? The answer depends on your risk tolerance, your traffic volume, and how quickly you need to roll back. So now with delivery, there are different ways you can deploy this new feature. One way is recreate. You stop running all existing servers and you start the new ones. So naturally, there's a period of downtime. The reason being the new servers would take some time to come up. This is only acceptable for non-critical systems or during maintenance windows. Then there's rolling update. This replaces instances one by one. At any point, some instances would be running an older version and some instances would be running the newer version. If something breaks in the middle, you stop and roll back. Kubernetes does this by default. There's no downtime per se. but your new and old versions run simultaneously. So your API must be backward compatible. Then there's blue-green deployment. You run two identical environments at the same time. Blue is the production existing one, green is the newer version. Once green is up and running, it's thoroughly tested, you switch the load balancer from distributing traffic to the blue version to the green version. Blue then becomes the standby version. If there's anything that is breaking in the newer version, rollback is instant. You just have to again switch the traffic from green to blue. Only downside here is you're paying for two full environments. If you have 1,000 servers, then during blue green, you're running 2,000 servers at the same time. Just think about the cost. Then there's canary release. Here, you send a small percentage of traffic, let's say 5% to the newer version. Then you monitor error rates, latency. If all the metric looks good, then you start increasing that percentage from 5% to 10 to 15 to 25 and then to 100%. Now, if something goes wrong in that 5%, you basically drain it, and 95% of the users never even experienced any of this. This is what Netflix, Meta, and Google uses for major releases. The next deployment strategy is feature flags. You deploy the code, but you control who sees the newer features through configuration, not through deployment. For example, you can enable a feature for internal users only or in a specific region. In this particular mechanism, the code is actually in production, but the feature is switched off. So it basically decouples the deployment from your releases. In our project, we are using the default deployment strategy, which is the rolling update. Our next concept is GitOps. This comes under the pillar of infrastructure as code, auditability, and consistency. Now, traditionally, if someone SSH into your production server, changed something, and months later something breaks, you don't know who did what. GitOps eliminates this problem entirely. The principle here is Git is the single source of truth, not just for application code, but also for Kubernetes manifests and other infrastructure configs. So nothing gets changed manually. Everything goes through a pull request. Now, how it works? It's done through a deployment tool, in our case, Argo CD. It runs as an operator within our Kubernetes cluster and constantly watches what's changing within our Git repository. When it detects a change in the Git, it applies to the cluster. Now, vice versa, if someone manually changes anything in the cluster, now Argo CD operator detects the drift and reverts it back to match what's in the Git. So you see, if anything that was changed within the cluster itself, the operator made sure it matches what's in the Git repository. Now, one of the key interview questions around GitOps is the deployment type. So there are two types of deployments. It's pull-based or push-based. Traditional CI/CD was push-based, in which the pipeline authenticates with the cluster and pushes the changes in. GitOps, on the other side, is pull-based. Argo CD runs inside the cluster and pull changes from Git. So the cluster never needs to be directly accessible by the CI pipeline, which really helps with the attack surface. Now the benefit again, it's with the audit tree. Every change is a Git commit. Who made it? Why? The PR description, what exactly changed? Rolling back is as simple as a Git revert. The entire history of your infrastructure is in version control. So we will be using Argo CD operator in our project, so stay tuned with that. To wrap it up, every single tool we use in this project solves a problem from this. If you understand these concepts, means you understand why this project was built in this way, not just how to run the commands. Like I said, this is very crucial for interviews, and hope these examples and this project gives you some talking points during an interview. In the next video, we'll be going through the entire architecture as well as the different workflows we will be building through the project. See you in the next one.